Before Jesus ascended into heaven, he gave his disciples the Great Commission to go forth and make disciples of the whole world. This means that the church is responsible for everyone, not just Catholics or people who believe in Jesus. This call requires the Catholic Church to speak out against oppression, serve the poor, fight for the rights of those who have none, and speak against all forms of sin in order to call people toward heaven. That's the church's mission, to lead people to heaven. In order to help people get there, the church must teach against anything that could potentially lead people away from living the abundant life that Jesus promised. This applies to things that we support and are comfortable with, but it also means that the church needs to take a stand on issues that people aren't particularly comfortable with. Christ's church must teach things that may not be always popular, and some that people may disagree with. One of those topics is homosexuality. People often misunderstand what the church teaches about homosexuality and believe that by teaching against it, the church hates people who experience same-sex attraction, or that Christ doesn't love them as much. This is simply not the case. In order to understand the church's teaching on homosexuality, we need to first know that the church is not about hating anyone, but about loving everyone. The church follows the two great commandments that Jesus gave us, the love of God and the love of neighbor. Everyone is called to this love. The church, as the bride of Christ, loves everyone as Christ loves them. Nothing can make Christ or the church stop loving a person, regardless of their past sin, sexual orientation, or gender. Part of love, though, is calling people out of sin and behaviors that could hurt them. Jesus says in Luke 17:3, "Be on your guard. If your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him." When it comes to sexuality, though, we may not feel we have the right to tell other people how to act. Many people believe that every individual should have the freedom to make their own decisions with their bodies. They see the church's teachings about sexuality as a restriction to freedom. Unfortunately, those people have it backwards. The church's teaching on sexuality is rooted in true freedom. Freedom is not simply being able to do whatever we want, but is truly found in doing God's will and following God's plan for our sexuality. Imagine if your friends got together to play a game, but nobody followed the rules. This wouldn't be an expression of freedom, it would be disaster. The game wouldn't work. True freedom is found by playing the rules that the game was designed by. When we follow God's plan and design for sex, we find freedom. When we tell people what the church teaches about sexuality, we aren't trying to ruin their lives. We're calling them to true freedom and happiness. God designed sex to be between a man and a woman because sex has two purposes, to be unifying and procreative. This means that it bonds a couple together and can bring forth life. God designed sex to take place in marriage because it is within the love of a married couple that sex can be expressed totally, freely, fruitfully, and faithfully. With these four qualities, sex fulfills its design and purpose. Without them, sex loses its purpose and simply becomes about using another person, even if we don't realize it. For thousands of years, people understood this truth. But things changed when contraception was introduced. It removed the procreative aspect of sex completely. People could have sex without thinking about having children and began to use sex for recreation. Sex was no longer unifying. It was about pleasure and use. We feel the effects of this in the many ways that marriage is now misunderstood. Celebrities who constantly marry and remarry, spouses who cheat on each other, and a high divorce rate are all symptoms of the mentality that we can separate sex from its true purpose within the sacrament of marriage. Because of this, we are more familiar with what sex and marriage should not be, rather than what it should be. When we remove sex from its purpose to be unifying and procreative, it becomes sinful. And sin creates chaos. It is choosing against the established rules that God gave us and creates disorder. Whenever we commit sin, whether it is sexual sins or another kind of sin, we choose chaos over God's plan and order. All sins are disordered expressions of our freedom. The church calls homosexual action disordered because it is not the correct expression of sex. It removes the procreative element from sex and reduces the purpose of sex to the use of another person. This does not mean that a person who experiences homosexual inclinations is disordered, but that homosexual actions are. Remember, all sin is disorder. This may not seem fair to deny two people who love each other the ability to have sex or to get married. The church's teaching about homosexuality isn't based on limiting people's freedom. It's about calling people to the life Christ called us to live. It isn't saying others are less, but it is calling everyone to more. Imagine having a friend who is diabetic, and you see that person eating a bunch of candy. You know that their choices are going to make them very sick, or even kill that person. Would you say something? What if that person responded to you that you needed to mind your own business and let them make their own choices? Would you do everything you could to get them to stop eating poorly if it meant saving their life? Of course you would. Even though your friend thinks that they are expressing their freedom by eating whatever they want, they're really on a path to a bleak future. You love your friend and want what is best for them, even if they are mad at you for it. Some of you may be uncomfortable with hearing all of this right now. You may be feeling that the church is not showing real compassion toward people who experience same-sex attraction. Well, compassion comes from the Latin root pati, which means to suffer. Real compassion is expressed when we suffer with someone. And that is what the church does with people who experience same-sex attraction. Christ suffered for us and died on a cross so we could be truly free. He expresses love for us, a true love that is built upon sacrifice. All love is modeled after this love. Christ calls people who identify as homosexual to continence. This means total abstinence from sexual activity. Anyone living outside the sacrament of marriage, heterosexual or homosexual, is called to continence. It is part of the larger virtue of chastity. Even married people are called to chastity within their marriage. Chastity is the successful integration of our sexuality and thus the inner unity of a person in his or her bodily and spiritual being. This means that our body and our soul are working in right order, that our spirit is leading our flesh. It allows us to be masters over our desires and passions, rather than letting them dominate us. This means sacrifice sometimes. A husband and wife make sacrifices for each other, just as a priest or religious brother or sister makes a sacrifice by renouncing marriage and sex. People who experience homosexual inclinations also make sacrifices, but Christ understands this sacrifice and walks with them. People who experience same-sex attraction are still called to love, to be in friendships, and to serve Christ with their lives. They can find strength, as we all can, in the sacraments of the Eucharist and reconciliation. They have many gifts and talents that God has blessed them with, and that they can use to build up the body of Christ. As a church, we need to be compassionate to our brothers and sisters who experience homosexual inclinations and same-sex attraction. They are fully deserving of the dignity that they have been given as children of God. If you are attracted to members of the same gender, know that the church does not hate you or condemn you. Christ loves you, and like all of us, calls us to self-sacrifice even when it is difficult. The church walks with you in that journey. There is true freedom in this self-sacrifice. It is the freedom to not be defined by our passions or temptations, but to be defined as a child of God. Everyone is called to this freedom, regardless of their sexual orientation. Ultimately, it is that freedom that will make us sharers in the abundant life that Christ spoke about, and in heaven.